On this episode of the podcast, I'm talking to Chris Ham. He is the manager of engineering operations at Novantas. A couple topics we're diving into this week are how his military background has really helped him, his military management experience. He is in charge of strategic vision for the DevOps team there, and he manages a rather large team, and his partnership and actual engagement with the DevOps team, the roadmap they build out. He's not hands-on, and he has a very unique seat at the table, and I'm just really excited for him to come and talk to us about how he makes an impact. Chris, thanks for being on the show.
Sure. Thanks, Amir. So I'm Chris Ham. I'm the manager of engineering operations with Novantas. I've got a portfolio that includes the DevOps group, our cluster operations group, some elements of a chief of staff to the CTO, and also organizing orchestration between the engineering and the infrastructure groups. Previous to current role in Novantas, I was on our advisory arm dealing with treasury and financial services analytics. And previous to that, I was at Capital One in roles both in treasury analytics and in technology finance. As you touched on, previous to that, I was in grad school, University of Maryland, with a master's in finance. And prior to that, I spent several years in the U.S. Navy as a reserve officer.
Awesome. And in terms of what Novantas specifically does, I know a little bit of background to kind of help maybe set context.
Sure. So Novantas has two arms. Our primary clients are financial services firms everywhere from some of the largest banks down to community banks, insurance, a variety of clients all in the financial services space. We provide advisory, data, and software services. The entire engineering department is 37-ish folks. We've got 2 to 3 DevOps guys, depending how you slice it. And then there's a couple of different IT folks that I work with closely and a couple of senior engineering VPs who have their own teams dealing with kind of app dev side and data engineering and how all those parts and pieces fit together. So it is not a 37-man DevOps shop.
That'd be a heck of a DevOps team. I've interviewed a few guests at some larger companies too, and I mean that would be up on the
wild.
Yeah, that would be a massive scale. And I do want to talk about your background in the military and how that has helped you, but I think maybe talk about your unique role, because I know when we spoke before the podcast, you have a very unique role in the sense that you're largely responsible for operations and the roadmap. And obviously, not all the time is that a role you see. Maybe that product manager hat is pretty integral. Maybe talk about what that role really means, and that'll help us a little bit.
Absolutely. So the CTO has a vision that he wants to execute as far as where technology goes, the platforming goes, and the underlying technology services that are critical to the product. Implementing that, he has broad plans to implement it, but somebody's got to go down and do a lot of the detail work and orchestration to make sure that the various parts and pieces that need to be organized and thought through at a super detailed level, separate from kind of the broad getting the groups to move in the same direction level, is well thought out. That is the 3 to 6 month kind of view. Closer in on the day-to-day level, more on the operations side, as all those roadmaps evolve and bumps come up, I go through and coordinate between the various groups what takes priority on the within the course of a day to overcome the roadblocks to keep things moving forward.
And in that sense, I guess I know you mentioned in your intro, you mentioned you coming from finance. You're non-technical, you don't code necessarily, but obviously you're technical now, and especially from a product manager standpoint. How's that relationship play out with that dynamic of, you're trying to execute the CTO's roadmap, you have engineering teams that you're interfacing with. How's that relationship typically play out?
Sure. So I'm comfortable so I guess as background, I have 0 formal technology education. Some elements of grad school for me did involve writing a little bit of code. I can write some Python, but no one should pay me to do it. But I've got enough of a technology background, enough of a systems engineering background from past experience to be able to know how the parts and pieces fit together. And then I also spent an awful lot of time reading docs. The level at which I'm working requires that, for as an example, I work with both the DevOps folks and our cluster operations folks. And being able to know enough about how the big data stack works and know enough about how the DevOps stack works to not necessarily be fluent in both, but to be able to do the translation from the problem that one side is feeling to the solution that the other one can provide.
Interesting. It almost seems like you have part like a McKinsey type role internally, because obviously you're looking at things a lot more strategically. You understand the technology and how the pieces move. You have a framework to kind of help see where probably roadblocks are coming, where emerging trends are going. It sounds like it's a highly strategic role because obviously you're trying to, bring down the CTO's vision and have the team, deliver short term to fit that long term plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's one of the elements that wasn't mentioned there was thinking about what trade-offs can get made in the short term to get us to that vision faster. So as we're thinking about maintenance and as we're thinking about kind of the operations side of systems upgrades, version changes, what can we skip and what's a must do and which features of which products get us where we want to go and what can we skip and just save that time and save that money for later or to get leverage elsewhere.
Awesome. It's quite an interesting role you have. I guess maybe when you're looking at, you mentioned obviously you did some work in your grad program and throughout you have some ancillary, experience with technology. Going back, I know you had mentioned your military management experience has played a large part. Maybe going back and looking at that and maybe talk to us a little bit about what you did in the military. And then we can maybe talk about how some of the tangible and intangible skills have kind of played forward now in what you're doing.
Sure. So, from a military perspective, so I was commissioned out of Massachusetts Maritime Academy as a strategic sea lift officer into the U.S. Navy Reserve. Over probably the middle 5 years of my 20s, I spent about 3 years on as an activated reservist. Some of that was spent teaching courses to incoming Navy reservists. Some of that was spent working in intelligence. Some of that was spent deployed to Kuwait doing customs operations. Really gave me a really broad background on kind of operations, staff work, and how all the parts and pieces fit together. That kind of fits into current role to the extent that it all relies on some form of operations planning and being able to predict where bumps are going to come in the road and have a plan to move around them when they arise.
I like how you mentioned how the parts and pieces fit together. I guess in that scenario, I guess the intangible skills from that experience, just the way you describe what you currently do, I draw a lot of analogy in terms of the way you describe probably both of them.
Yeah, it's heavy on the logistics side and heavy on the planning side, much less heavy on kind of the things you typically think of the military being, but integral to the parts that keep the wheels on the military.
Interesting. Interesting. I guess when you did leave the military and it was time to go into private sector, go into industry. I was just always curious because obviously Capital One is where you started out at. It was financial analyst for technical operations. How different is that when you're leaving the military and you're taking your first job in terms of kind of just the structure, understanding different processes? Obviously, there's a different rigor in terms of expectations potentially.
It's surprisingly similar. For the roles I was fulfilling in the military versus what I was doing in tech ops finance at Capital One, it's still spreadsheet based and still forecasting based. The units of measure are different, but the outcome is basically the same. It was also convenient that I had a year's worth of grad school between to get more comfortable with the finance specific subject matter expertise.
Interesting. So now that you kind of talked about how similar actually the experience was going from military to your first role at Capital One, do you think that from the most part what you see as the similarities of the intangibles that you're able to take away, do you think other people when they look at it from the outside see those? Because I think a lot of times when as a recruiter I just share that when you're looking at somebody with a military background, you're trying to understand what they did and it's a little bit challenging until you talk to the person and you really get a good idea of, oh, it's much more operations based. And then you go, I see the analogies. Do you think sometimes maybe there's that ability to kind of articulate or maybe tell the right story of what you did in your military background that kind of would help with an easier transition to the first job or industry?
Absolutely. I think there's a challenge that veterans have in setting up their resumes to call out these civilian skill sets that are applicable and that employers find incredibly valuable, just because the phrasing and the direct transition aren't necessarily obvious. So the ability to do operations planning or having a background in logistics or electronics repair or cyber warfare or whatever you did in the military, all of those various pieces are usually very highly valued by employers as long as you can turn it into and tease out the skills that are still valuable, like being able to do data organization, being able to plan ahead, being able to be comfortable muscling through or being able to operate with ambiguity.
I think that's a great point. And I think as someone who sees a lot of resumes, I think that's the first thing I always gravitate towards, especially if it's a veteran. I'm always focused on, can we draw out some things that are, not focused on maybe some of the military jargon or the specifics, some of the intangibles would be nice. And I think that would help a lot. And I think from your standpoint, what you're describing, it sounds like the transition was really easy into Capital One. It almost, sounded like a very similar job, similar set of skills. Capital One, obviously, you progressed into a manager role at your current place and kind of obviously into management full fledged. I mean, some of the management stuff that you're doing now, going back to some of the intangibles that you had seen from the military experience, is that giving you an advantage, do you think? Because I think a lot of people, especially from military planning, we have different images. Again, being a civilian, everything's glorified about the military, right? You always think about one side of it. We never think about the 90%, as you mentioned, that never actually go to the front line. It's all, lots of logistics operations. It's a monster behemoth to manage. But the management aspect of it, it sounds like it's been a massive advantage for you.
Yeah, I think in the small unit leadership view, the comfort with operating with ambiguity and the comfort with seeing a ball that's getting ready to drop and being comfortable diving in and catching it and having alternative plans for when things don't go as planned.
Absolutely. So I guess in your current role, when you're, talking about the roadmap and you're forward thinking to kind of see what's coming up, I guess going back to sitting down and talking to, the engineering team, DevOps, talking to the CTO, what's your typical mindset in terms of approaching, that roadmap? Are you looking for an outcome and backtracking into helping the team figure out their priorities? Are you looking at a backlog? Like, what are you doing to structure the roadmap and work backwards?
Sure. So the product team has a roadmap that they need to get to because we promised it to the customer. And first, at Novantas, our big goal is to solve customer problems. And so to the extent product sets us up and can articulate those problems clearly, we'll figure out how to solve them. That being said, along the way, we can take some time and energy to figure out how technology is changing and do proofs of concept that kind of branch off to the side, but that if product changes the direction, we already have enough technical know-how in-house to be able to pivot and bring them solutions for problems that are rapidly emerging.
Interesting. I guess when you're looking at the delivery side of it, how does accountability kind of fall? Obviously, you're focused on the long-term vision. The team is, trying to execute on a short term, like the roles and responsibilities and your involvement from the top down. Are you matrixed into each team potentially, or are you just kind of focused on just staying higher level and having the weekly meetings to kind of figure out where things are going?
Yeah, so it's an interesting blend. I'm in daily stand-ups as product owner and sometimes scrum master for our DevOps team, our cluster operations team, our tech services team, our database team, a product-specific team we rolled out recently for a new product. And then in architectural discussions. And in a lot of those, I'm not necessarily a contributor, but I at least am there to gain enough context to know where the roadmaps are going to bump into each other in a day, a week, or a month, and then figure out how to deconflict those, either from a timing perspective or from a technology capacity perspective.
Interesting. I guess, yeah, it's just your role, as the product owner, as the chief of staff, the CTO, there seemingly are so many hats that I just was kind of figuring out like what depth do you get? Because obviously you could potentially be responsible for delivering something as well as also being the product owner and then also then liaising with the CTO to make sure that execution is staying on path. I mean, you're managing a 37-person team. That's pretty substantial. So yeah, I just was kind of curious how that plays out, which is what you just described is interesting.
Yeah, and there's also a split where the CTO gets deep in the weeds on some elements of it, and I get deep into the weeds on other elements of it. For example, the CTO is very good at the big data side and the data engineering side and more of the view of how the parts and pieces fit together and how they can tie into analytics that are useful for the customer. I tend to focus a little further down the stack and be comfortable where the lower parts of servers, the network, the traditional IT domains tie into DevOps and tie into big data ops.
Awesome. I think from what you're describing, you definitely sound like you're almost like you're part product owner, part consultant, part visionary for the team in terms of where they're going. It sounds like a very mixed role. I think when I reached out to you at first, I was like, when I did reach out, I was like, I saw like multiple aspects of the role, and I was like, this guy's either doing something really cool or he just doesn't sleep, because it sounds like he he does a billion things, and it sounds like you probably do a billion things, and you probably it definitely seems like a very challenging role.
Every day is a decision of what's not going to get done.
How does that get prioritized? I guess when you're looking at decisions of what doesn't get done, do you score, categorize what priority is, and who do you potentially have to liaison with to kind of figure that piece out?
It depends on what it is. So, for example, when I'm wearing my vendor management hat, if the contract's about to expire and some software is not going to work, that's definitely a today project. On delivery, if there are various initiatives that have tight deadlines and that are starting to see some bumps in the road, if I can stomp out those fires before they fully burst into flames, that's where I'll put the energy. And then the longer term roadmap items take a little bit of a back seat, but to the extent I still need to have enough forethought in it to know where, if I can only give a small nudge, can I have the most impact.
I guess when you're actually then having to go back to the CTO to kind of stay within his prioritization areas that he feels like, I guess, the long-term vision, is that a dynamic where, you're now figuring out obviously his priority, your daily priority, I guess the short-term, the micro, the macro. Does the conflict get resolved, via, your weekly one-on-one? Is it I've got to go talk to you because obviously, here focus on the big data, but hey, listen, there's this area that needs to get addressed. How do you typically resolve conflicts between maybe his prioritization and what you're seeing, from your daily shift on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so the long strategic vision changes pretty slowly, and how the various engineering teams tack to get to that final point changes more quickly is kind of the technology wind shift. The battle rhythm of it is that I talk to the CTO on a weekly basis, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours, and figure out where the short-term view is playing out as we expect, what bumps are coming up, and then just give them a quick readout of what's not going as planned and what is going as planned. And then we adjust as we have to. Sometimes the POC doesn't play out the way you'd expect, and it's time to pivot. Sometimes everything goes smoothly.
It sounds like, tying back to what you described with the logistics of piecing things together from the military and what you're describing now, it's very interesting how some of the words and phrases have changed of what you're doing, the context, but it sounds like, you're actually through your career, it's been pretty consistent in terms of being able to carry through the core of what probably you excelled at throughout your career. So I guess just in terms of, and I'm hoping, as the podcast gets out there and reaches more people, I always am hoping somebody's going to reach out and follow up with other questions in terms of, your background or maybe an experience you've gone through. And I guess, talking about your military transition, hopefully, that could spark somebody to reach out. Is LinkedIn for you the best avenue and for somebody to reach out if they do have a follow-up question?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going to put that in the show notes. I'm hoping people do. I've not covered the transition from a military to civilian career in a podcast. I'm excited to have people here and kind of maybe draw some analogies or maybe draw it from your experience and have them reach out to you for further feedback and assistance. But I appreciate you sharing your background with us and kind of what you do. It sounds like you definitely don't have enough time in the day, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Absolutely, it's been great.
Absolutely. So thanks for everyone for listening. We will definitely come back again next week with another episode, and we'll be back with a different guest. If there's any topics you like for us to explore, if something you heard that you want us to dive into further, always looking for different ideas for the podcast. And then definitely please subscribe and listen, and we'll be back again. Thanks.